Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to another episode of TFiR Let's Talk. And today we have with us Jim Brisimitzis, founder and general partner at 5G Open Innovation Lab. Jim, it's great to have you on the show.
It's good to be part of the show. Thank you for inviting me on.
It's my pleasure. Now, before we get started, I would love to hear from you a bit about 5G Open Innovation Lab. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so we're an open innovation program. We work with companies of all stages, from early stage to teams that are Series C, Series D level. We're not an accelerator incubator program, so we don't take any fees or take any equity. We're entirely backed by 14 corporate partnerships that include Intel, Microsoft, T-Mobile, Spirent, Ericsson, Nokia, Accenture, and the list goes on. From an open innovation standpoint, we truly are a program that is looking at the software opportunity of 5G. We're excited about where communications connectivity is going and what it's going to unlock as it relates to where the edge is. But no one's really built a software ecosystem around the true potential of 5G and edge computing, and that's what our program focuses on. So we end up spending a lot of time with enterprise teams that are building capabilities, both in the communication sector, but also in edge applications and edge infrastructure, that are really building the use cases that will take advantage of where connectivity and edge computing is going to go.
And since you're here, I would love to hear your thoughts on the evolution of 5G. How would you define what is 5G in today's world?
5G on the carrier CSP or service provider side is really the cloudification of their networks. You see, carriers in the 4G LTE world and then previous generations before that were essentially buying into monolithic architectures, right? Fixed function network architectures for the sole purpose of delivering connectivity and voice. Worked out really, really well. In the 5G standards, there's a number of new capabilities that are being rolled out in the essence of 5G, like network slicing, dynamic spectrum sharing, and others. And in doing so, they're really moving towards cloudified architectures. So everything is mostly microservices based. There's a lot of use now of open source capabilities. O-RAN's a hot topic in this environment. So if the carriers are moving away from, over time, moving away from monolithic-like architectures to programmable networks, essentially. And in many respects, although they're not one-to-one, but in many respects, conceptually, the carriers' network environments are going more mainstream, similar to what the cloud providers have done with their networks as well in terms of supporting applications. So as a CSP, you're moving more to digitization and cloudification of your network operations, which now opens up this whole new world of opportunity, not just in the sense of classic communication services, but also in how do you use that network to maybe support the software ecosystem. And that's where the edge to us is really, really exciting. Now, in parallel to that, and nothing to do with where 5G is going, most software developers today are moving away themselves from classic applications running in VMs, and they're moving more to microservices. Kubernetes is an example of that. And so there's these two patterns that are sort of converging, right? As carriers are cloudifying their networks and moving more to services in microservices form, so are app builders. And the edge is a place where a lot of these new use cases are really going to play out. And the edge happens to be an area that enterprises are looking at as well for a host of new use cases that include robotics and drones and other new things. The ability to push out compute to where the edge is vital, and it's an opportunity that's coming in a fairly big way. And the carriers are naturally, just by service of their networks, on the edge. And so then we looked at that and said, well, how do you build a software ecosystem around that so that carriers can actually maybe expose some of their network capabilities and potentially even some edge services to developers who, as we've seen in the cloud world and as we've seen in mobile as well, have built great new applications and capabilities that have generated trillions of dollars worth of upside. And so we wanted to go build that software ecosystem because really the timing is right to do that today. And there really isn't an environment or a program that's really exploring that opportunity. So we felt that was a need in the market that needed to be solved. So for us, 5G, again, just to recap, is really cloudification of networks. It's a new pivot for the CSP world, and you're going to see that continue to proliferate in new standards that go on beyond 5G, like 6G and 7G and everything else beyond that.
What kind of adoption of 5G are you seeing in the enterprise space? And if you can share some use cases, that would be great.
Sure. So adoption is a pretty weighted word. If you want to talk about adoption of 5G devices in the enterprise, I don't have the amounts in front of me. I would speculate that we're starting to see that adoption grow in somewhat healthy ways. And that adoption is not tied to just mobile phones. It's tied to connected laptops, IoT sensors, and others. We're still globally early days into the full adoption of 5G. What most people forget is that each of these Gs is usually a 10 to 15 year run, right? So just because we see a lot of marketing in 5G doesn't necessarily mean we're truly there. But the other area that enterprises are exploring under the 5G banner is what's called private enterprise wireless networking, meaning an enterprise could decide that they want to augment, supplement, or full on just move into cellular-based wireless networking, which would be an adjunct to or replacement of, in my humble opinion, I think it would be an adjunct to what we see today with corporate Wi-Fi. And that's really important. We have one of our teams that is working with a large mining operation in Canada that has moved to private cellular networking because they wanted to automate the production of, in their case, what they were doing in the mining world. Autonomous vehicles that are, running around in these mining pits doing a lot of the work. Well, you need to move to cellular-based connectivity for those use cases because Wi-Fi has limitations, not just in bandwidth, but also in reach as well. And cellular becomes the world to do that. That market itself is a healthy market, and it's starting to grow. Some estimates that we've seen out of the analyst community suggest that that market could grow at 48% CAGR year on year. So there's a healthy amount of interest, I would say. We're starting to see early deployments of private 5G. And I believe, my personal opinion is that private 5G or private wireless networking is going to be an area that enterprises are going to invest in because it unlocks a number of new capabilities that they're not able to today, given some of the limitations with wireless.
One of the very interesting debate that is going on in this space is the future of technology like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, especially with the arrival of private 5G network. The fact is that these technologies will continue to coexist. They are going to complement each other. They are not competitors, they are going to complement each other. But I want to hear your thoughts on it. What do you think is the reality actually?
There's a raging debate as we speak around the future of Wi-Fi with Wi-Fi 6 and what's to come in Wi-Fi 7 versus cellular, the complexities of cellular over the ease of use and the vast ecosystem today that exists around Wi-Fi. Look, honestly, I think the two are going to coexist. There's many use cases where Wi-Fi really provides that simplicity, bandwidth, security, and range that really matters for a certain set of use cases. And then there's others that it just doesn't, right? And that's where cellular really starts to play more of a role. What I have seen outside of my own private opinions around versus Wi-Fi, what I have seen is that many enterprises are really exploring cellular-based wireless because of the inherent security, the reach of these networks, the growing connectivity that comes with the devices now that have 4G LTE today, 3G in the old days, now 5G that's coming as well. So I don't think there's a clear line today where enterprises are saying, well, these are really Wi-Fi based things, and this is going to be where cellular is. What I do see is a lot of enterprises are kicking around and experimenting with wireless connectivity because they've reached the limitations that exist today in 5G. And those limitations are typically due to range of these Wi-Fi networks, in addition to, in some cases, security. And so from that standpoint, I do see that private cellular-based wireless is a market that's here to stay, will continue to grow healthily. I think it's going to coexist with the Wi-Fi standards and evolve over time.
I'm also curious, are there any specific use cases that are now possible because of 5G and 5G private networks, which was not possible earlier?
There are some use cases that I've seen. These are by no means set in stone. There's just observations that I've had. There are certain use cases in the robotics world that really depend on ultra low latency and managed jitter in many respects. And in some cases, Wi-Fi is great for that. In many cases, cellular really is a better platform. So I've seen in certain use cases across industries where you really have to have a high quality of service because these robots are operating in very confined areas and need to operate within certain specifications, that cellular really becomes a must, not a want. I'm similarly so. I'm seeing a lot of that actually playing out in the autonomous world, whether it's autonomous mining equipment that I had mentioned earlier or others, where cellular really starts to shine a little bit more. And then in augmented reality, we're starting to see cellular-based augmented reality really being sort of a mainstay, right? To deliver the high fidelity services that you need in the field or in areas where Wi-Fi's reach is limited for whatever reason. we're seeing that augmented reality in the world of cellular becomes, really, really important. And you're starting to see that the folks who are developing these augmented reality headsets. They either have cellular-based dongles that can attach to the headsets, or actually embedding that connectivity straight into the headsets themselves. So those are early days, right? But then the fun part of this is, if you go back to the early days of the internet, right, when we said, like, who's going to be online, right? We can only imagine what's possible when developers get their hands on a new set of capabilities, and that's what we wanted the lab to really set up to do, was to do that. One of our teams that really is seeing a lot of these use cases on the forefront is a team that we're both familiar with, called GenXCom, or GXC, and they're providing turnkey private cellular mesh networking capabilities to enterprises. They're doing this for several agencies at the federal level here in the United States, and a lot of enterprises as well. And they're starting to see similar use cases come out. Now, the complexity of cellular is a stark contrast to the simplicity of Wi-Fi. We're not there on the cellular side, because a lot of these cellular networks were designed for the big service providers to deploy at nation scale. So there's a lot of engineering and work that's going to happen that's going to bring the complexity of deploying and planning and implementing cellular-based networks to be more in line with Wi-Fi over time. And GenXCom has, I think, done a great job of bringing that simplicity to bear in the enterprise.
We are hearing and talking a lot about Web 3.0. I talk to a lot of companies, and sometimes they feel a pain that their developer teams have to push everything all the way to the cloud, which is not needed in most cases. And sometimes they just are working on something locally, and they crave for the good old Web 1.0 experience, where they were even running mail servers on their own. Of course, they don't want to run web server or mail server today, but they do crave for owning a lot of stack. They do care about controlling quite a lot of things instead of depending on cloud for everything. There may be a lot of different reasons why organizations don't want to send their data all the way to the centralized cloud. What are your thoughts about that, and what role do you think 5G can play in enabling that kind of experience?
Right. So if I've done anything well today, it's to simulate or to push this notion that 5G really is about connectivity and computing fusing together, right? There was a very famous engineer at Sun Microsystems, John Gage, I believe was his name, that said the network is the computer. It's a trademark now of Cloudflare's. That is essentially what I see. So to answer your question directly, I think that we're going to get to a world, and we're already seeing it right now, where exabytes worth of data is being generated, and moving exabytes worth of data to a public cloud for processing and storing and rendering inside an application, either economically or from a physics perspective, just doesn't make sense. We have several teams that what they do, they're generating terabytes and petabytes worth of annually, and moving all that to cloud instances for processing just doesn't make sense, because their customers want real-time analytics. They want real-time access to that, the outcome of that data. So the edge becomes a really interesting space where that starts to happen. Now, if you take this notion of connectivity and computing really fusing, to an app developer, they don't have to think about, is what I'm trying to connect to connected, because it is, and they don't have to necessarily worry about, well, where's all that new data being processed, or created, where is it going to be processed? That essentially will get federated out to these, vast edge networks. So they could be edge networks in the service provider world. They could be edge networks that are tucked behind private enterprise branch networks themselves, right? So to them, I think the edge is the Wild West of opportunity and possibility. But with that comes a ton of complexity. I think over time, and you're starting to see this from the big cloud vendors, they all have edge stories and capabilities that are extensions of their core cloud capabilities that are moving further to edge. That's indicative of my world of how important the edge is going to be. So I think the data sovereignty and all that fun stuff is one matter, and that's a whole other conversation. Certainly in different areas of the world where that's really taken seriously. But here in the United States, what I'm seeing is early days of the proliferation of new data that's being generated that needs to be processed locally, because the use case demands that the insights from that are actually near real time, if not real time. And that's where the edge is really going to start to shine. I'll give you another example. The average vehicle today is generating north of 300 terabytes or gigabytes worth of data a day. And to the automakers, they really need tidbits of that data to inform their predictive maintenance and other things that they want to do in those vehicles to ultimately create a better experience for their customers. Well, are you going to move 300 gigabits of data across a fleet of 1 million plus vehicles a day to a public cloud instance? while that's possible today, in many respects, it makes a lot of sense to actually process some of that data in nearby edge computing world. And that's where I think things are going to be going long term. Now, once we've really broken into that edge world as a as a developer ecosystem and really understand its capabilities and all of the capabilities around the edge really start to come to play. What I predict is going to happen is a lot of new data capabilities are going to be extracted, and whatever those use cases are, processed locally, maybe even stored locally, depending on what the use case demands. And it's going to parlay itself very well to where the big cloud services exist today, and extending the very high level services from those in big AI, big ML, big computer vision as an extension out to the edge. So that's where I'm super excited. And just to plug why we started the lab, I think that's a really interesting, exciting, compelling area for the service providers to maybe even play a role in some of that as well, because their networks are connecting to a lot of these systems and devices and such.
I also want to talk about one of the hottest topic, which has been kind of around for a while, which is edge. First of all, it depends on who you talk to, the way they define edge. It could be a resource constrained environment. It could be a data center near user. It could be a tiny IoT device. It could be just a sensor. So first of all, how would you define edge, and what role is 5G playing in this space?
Sure. That's a loaded term, right? Of what the edge is. I certainly have my opinions of it. I think edge is about proximity computing. It's a fabric of computing and connectivity for app developers to take advantage of in whatever use cases that they're creating to develop, new experiences and new services, new products that delight their users. In some respects, edge could be as simple as our mobile phones or some capacity on an IoT sensor or IoT, gateway, and that's suffices. In other respects, it could be metro area edge networks, and we have a partner called Vapor.io that's providing the infrastructure to host some of that capability as well. So the edge market, as I mentioned earlier, is really the Wild West. There are a lot of vendors, in my humble opinion, that have opinions on that because a lot of their products and services are really based on making those services available. I still think we're a few years out from really truly understanding what the capacity and capability of the edge is. We'll get there over time. But I do think it's proximity-based computing for whatever the applications demand for users themselves. And I know that's a bit of a loosey explanation, but that's the best I have right now, given what I'm seeing across the market, which is still very dynamic.
I also want to talk a bit about one of the biggest players in this space, which is CSPs or carriers. How are they looking at private 5G network, and should they look into it?
They absolutely should. No question in my mind. I think it's a new world for them. And the best analogy that I could provide, that's very familiar to me, is I'm a almost 14-year veteran of my time at Microsoft, really enjoyed everything I learned there. And I saw Microsoft go through a pretty significant transition where it was taking its on-prem products and converting them into services. So, Windows Server to Azure, or the Exchange Server to Office 365 as an example. It wasn't just a transformation of the products into these new now cloud-enabled services, all multi-tenant and everything else. It was a fundamental culture change for Microsoft. And it fundamentally changed how we sold products and how we approached our enterprise customers at the time, and still do. And I think CSPs or service providers are in that same world. They're very comfortable with the business model today to put SIM cards into devices, mobile phones, vehicles, IoT devices, and such. When you step into this world of edge, and more importantly, maybe even exposing some of your network capabilities to developers, that's a whole new world. And I don't think, my personal opinion, they've really gotten there and embraced what that capability means just yet. On the private cellular network side, we've seen endless FCC auctions and similar auctions for spectrums around the world, where CSPs or service providers are spending literally billions of dollars buying spectrum for use by their consumer customers. I think they're sitting on a gold mine where a lot of those markets do support a number of enterprises. And so I think there's really interesting business models that the service provider world should be looking at, not just in standing up these private networks for enterprises, what that could mean as relatable services that expose more of their network capabilities beyond private cellular networks. I'll give you an example of that. Let's say there's a large logistics provider here in the United States or anywhere else in the world that happens to have, for one of its distribution centers, a private cellular network. Well, it's one thing to enable all the connectivity inside that warehouse and in the trucks. But what happens when those trucks or the goods from that warehouse or distribution center are moving out into into its next destination? Well, that's a seamless opportunity for the carrier, not just to provide the private enterprise networking capabilities for that distributor in that one location, but also now to basically meld together their public network to these private networks so that you have this consistent, persistent connectivity to those devices and the computing capabilities as well that would demand, that would be demanded in certain use cases as well. That's where the model changes, right? So from my standpoint, I think the service providers are sitting on a goldmine of opportunity in this highly connected world that they operate in today. There's an opportunity for them to actually play a bigger role in where the software ecosystem is and where it's going. They really haven't played a greater, a great depths like the cloud providers have. And I think 5G is the turning point where they could really start to explore that. We don't know what all the answers are. So we, created a startup program and surrounded it with a number of amazing technology and service provider partners. So we can learn on that journey together. We don't have the holy grail or the silver bullet of how to get there, but we've created the software ecosystem around, and that's what we're pursuing.
Jim, thank you so much for taking time out today and, of course, talk about the organization, the whole evolution of 5G, how the industry is embracing it and actually growing with it. So thanks for sharing those insights, and I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Thank you, Swapnil, for inviting me on. I appreciate it. Great session. I appreciate your time. Thank you.